behind the scenes, where I'll be showcasing the making of a map part for original characters, multi-animator project, You're No Fun Anymore. For this behind the scenes, I will call multi-animator project as map and original character as OC. Without further ado, let's get into this one. You're No Fun Anymore original character map is hosted by Lady Telia, whose maps I've joined in the past, Prove Me Wrong, and Lights Out, to name a few. As a fun fact, Lights Out was the very first map to be called map instead of met, as they were called around 2010 up to 2012 before Lights Out map came out. So yes, the term multi-animator project has been around for nearly 10 years. I knew I was ancient in YouTube terms, but not like this. My internal identity crisis aside, Lady Telia has proven herself to me being a lovely host over and over again, which is why I always draw right back to her projects whenever she posts them. But the reason why I joined this particular map of hers is that how strong vibes I got from the song to my comic Yellow. Lady Telia's music taste, or overall the songs she picks for her maps, are nearly always something that fit Yellow fairly often. I would love to animate Yellow characters more often if given the opportunity. However, given how specific genre or storyline Yellow has, plus its very limited cast, it makes it a bit difficult to fit just any song for the characters. In case you missed it, Yellow is my original comic that follows a post-breakup drama between Tulip and Jake. A few months ago, I made a speed paint series of all the 4 characters that appear in the comic. If you're curious, I'd recommend checking them out. As the comic itself, it's currently readable over at my DeviantArt and is currently fully posted up to chapter 2. The link for the first page will be in the description. Since this is an OC map, this map doesn't have a specific script, because everyone is going to use their own characters. The beauty of OC maps is this specific reason, and why those may draw a lot of interest from potential participants. However, OC maps can be limited in other ways than a script, and help make it much more consistent visually. Many OC map hosts use color palettes or give guidelines for colors, and that is the most common way of gaining a unified feel to the map as a whole. While specific scripts aren't that common, sometimes OC maps can hold a specific theme to them, such as grief, happy moments, or an action-packed theme. For this map part, I picked up 2 scenes from the comic that include some sort of confrontation between the characters. The first scene appears in chapter 1, and the second scene happens at the end of chapter 2. The character being confronted is called Jake, and the characters confronting him are Sabrina in the first scene and Michael in the second. Because the 2 scenes happen at 2 different places at 2 different times of the day, blending them together through a seamless transition was going to be a challenge. A small one, sure, but a challenge nonetheless. I had the vision of what to do very strongly in my mind ever since I got a confirmation of which part I was going to get. On top of asking for part 10, I also asked for parts 14, 3, and 6, just in case. Here's the storyboard of my part, where I roughly placed and timed everything. But instead of hopping straight into sketching out the keyframes, I made full roughs of the animation itself. I did this with the Holyleaf map part I uploaded a month prior to this part, so I decided to continue and play around with the idea where I roughly do the movement before focusing on details. This method has its positives, such as it lets you focus on the movement as a whole, instead of focusing on the details too much. Of course, because this is a super rough animation, it has some room for trial and error. Those can be fixed and tweaked during the sketching phase, but here the idea is to get the general movement towards the direction you want it to, without spending ages perfecting the details of the sketch itself. Another thing I use this rough stage for is to put down the general characteristic shapes of each of the characters. Jake is angular, Sabrina has a bit elegant design to her, and Michael has fluff. This will also benefit me later on keeping everything more consistent and in the right size, because I have guidelines to follow when sketching. This animation is done primarily with 2s, with some trees sprinkled in. Because the deadline was tight with this part, I decided to use as few frames as possible. Limited animation is something I've gotten better with lately. Admittedly, there are still moments where I really struggle with using fewer frames than I would like, especially when it comes to more subtle movements. Once I was pleased with how these messy doodles were looking, I began to sketch them out. First, I did the keyframes, and then filled in the in-between frames. Everything remained pretty much how it was during the rough animation stage, but I changed one thing from the first shot. When Jake looks up to Sabrina, I felt like he didn't take enough time looking at her. I added one frame to the movement, and while I feel like I could have tweaked it a little bit further, it's still significantly better than what I had in the rough stage. With the sketch on hand, I began the cleanup process. For this animation, I primarily drew every line art, frame by frame, individually, except for Jake on the first shot. Where Jake follows Sabrina with his gaze, I wanted to keep his lower body still. Instead of lining every frame of him individually, I saved time by drawing his lower body onto a layer below, and then drawing the head movements individually from chest up to the layer above. The work might seem a bit wasted, since his lower body doesn't show up that much on the frame, but it still saved time. With maps that have a bit tighter deadline, or that you wish to complete at a faster pace, sometimes you have to make time-saving sacrifices, whether it be limiting frames, cutting out shading, or cutting out specific details you would like to add. In this particular part, I decided to cut down on the number of frames I would use. As I said earlier, this animation has been majorly done with 2s, with some trees sprinkled in to stretch out the movement whenever necessary. This means that during the head turns Jake does in the first scene, the movements are done within 5 up to 7 frames. This same theme continues in the second last shot of scene 2, where Michael has Jake pinned against the window, and Jake turns his head sharply to see Michael dragging his claws nearby him. Another part where I decided to save time was shading, but I will explain my thoughts regarding that process later. While during the sketching phase I made sure that the timing and flow of the animation go well, I did small, minor tweaks during the line art process if I saw it necessary. So, in theory, I went through my animation 3 times before you all see the final version. Rough animation, sketched out animation, and lined animation. With the cleanup done and movements finalized for real, it's time for color. As you probably noticed, during the past 2 behind the scenes videos, I have done quick references for the characters that I'm animating. This time, I actually have had those references around me for a while. I have had them for nearly 5 years. And even though they aren't probably as up-to-date style-wise, they still have all the necessary details of the characters included. I will will most likely one day make updated reference sheets, but since I'm already tight on time, this will have to do. Besides, markings of the characters and colors haven't changed, and those are the two main reasons why I'll be looking at these reference sheets, so it doesn't honestly matter in this case whether these are a year or a century old. They still do their job well. This is also another beauty of OC maps. Unless the OC map is dedicated to someone's specific OC, more often you are in charge of the character design and adjusting the colors accordingly, if there's a color palette or limitations in color involved. Because I have drawn these characters several times during the comic, doing the coloring went by like a breeze. Sabrina's head tuft may seem intimidating, due to the color gradient included, but that one was very therapeutic for me to do. I focused on 2 points of the line art, and used that as a guide where to pull the gradient from and where to stop. Because Adobe Animate is a vector program, I had to always close the area I was going to color by a gradient so it doesn't leak everywhere within the closed line art space. Which, in this case, would have been the entire body during the majority of the frames. As the coloring was done, I went ahead to work with backgrounds. You probably noticed from the finished product that the backgrounds I did for this animation were more simplistic than what I normally do. This was actually not because I was trying to save time. I wanted to stick with the simple style because the backgrounds in the comic are also very plain and flat colored. I wanted to stick with that in order to make a fun connection between animation and the comic it is based upon. If you watched the behind the scenes video of Lay All Your Love on Me map part, you may recall how I said that I dreaded getting into the background for that animation because it involved so many turns. Well, apparently I don't like finding easy solutions for my problems, so here we are with another background turn. However, unlike last time, this time I felt confident about what I was doing. But the downside was that I needed to do it twice. As you probably have figured out by now, or read the description of the original map part like a good viewer, I didn't make the final transition in Animate. That means I need to animate 2 backgrounds to match the turn on 2 separate layers. Help. Because Jake sits at similar locations in both of the shots, I decided to make a grid that will help me to make both of the backgrounds. The first scene includes a row of school lockers, and the second scene includes a full window wall of a cafe. The logical solution was that I included the individual lockers into the grid and used the furthest locker row as a corner wall of the cafe building, while the rest will remain as the window. Sounds simple enough? Well, in theory it was very straightforward. However, before I had a chance to animate the turn with the cafe wall background, I managed to delete the grid and realized way too late what I had done. It sounded like a disaster at the time, but thank goodness it was an easy fix. Minus the grid fiasco, everything else went according to plan. With the first shot of the second scene, I made the buildings and the streets on their separate layers because I was going to create some depth there with the Gaussian blur effect in After Effects. Now that we have the coloring and backgrounds done, it means we can get into After Effects, right? No, not yet. Earlier I mentioned ways of cutting down corners in order to get this animation done faster, and one of those methods was not doing shading. Even though I decided not to shade my part, I still wanted to make the characters match their surroundings. It's time to make a mask and adjust the character colors with some layer modes. Masking in Adobe Animate is something I have learned completely on my own. I never found proper tutorials for it, So I guess that's why I wanted to include this section here. If you're using Adobe Animate and haven't figured out how to make masks in Animate, this is a method to add overlays and other layer modes onto your animation. Feel free to improvise and expand from this if this happens to be your first time hearing about it. Here is how to make a mask in Adobe Animate in nice and easy 7 steps. Step 1. Duplicate your coloring layer or the layer you have all the coloring done onto. I know that some people make both their line art and color on the same layer, but I personally prefer to separate the two just in case. Technically, I do have line art and coloring on the same layer, but in the case of emergencies, I keep a copy of my line art layer always available. Step 2. Rename the duplicated layer as mask, or something else that makes it easy to recognize. As you rename it, open up the layer properties. From there, switch the type from normal to mask and click OK. Now you should see this icon of the layer switch up from piece of paper into a square that has a white circle in the middle of it. Step 3. Make a new layer and drag it below the mask layer. Step 4. Before making any other adjustments, I erase the color from the eyes and then color all the frames into a color that sticks out. Don't worry, this face is completely optional, but this way I have an easier time recognizing if I accidentally am on the mask layer than on the coloring layer. For coloring the frames, I turn on Edit Multiple Frames mode right next to the onion skin. Select everything and switch the color. Step 5. Once I have done step 4, I get onto the layer below the mask layer. With the help of onion skin, I'll figure out how big of a space the color that will mask the colored frames needs to be. Once I have everything double checked, that the mask moves within the square I have made, I'll go ahead and color the square with the desired color. In this case, I'll be using violet. Step 6. As I have the square, I will turn it into a symbol. I achieve this by pressing F8 on my keyboard on Windows, as that's the shortcut. Step 7. Once the square has been made into a symbol, I go to Properties window and open up the section called Blend. From there, I turn my violet symbol from normal to multiply. Then I move from Blend section to Color Effects. In this section, I switch None from the drop-down menu into Alpha. With Alpha, you can change the opacity of the symbol you have created. In my case, I turn it to 40%. And that's it! I have a mask for my animation done completely in Adobe Animate. Here's the comparison between when the mask is visible on top of the color layer and when it is not. I should note that in order to see the mask in its intended use, you need to lock both the mask layer and what's included in the mask. Otherwise, it may look a little bit weird, but I promise it's there. Now that I have everything done in Adobe Animate, let's switch up programs. Instead of exporting my Animate file into something else than it already is, I import it as a composition into After Effects. That way, I still have control over all the layers individually and make changes accordingly. Because it was around 2 AM at night when I was making the final edits for this map part, I apologize for any process that is missing from the recording. I plan to cover my work in After Effects more extensively in the future. But I hope this will at least give a small picture of what and how I'm doing things. As everything is exported into After Effects, I open the composition. Inside the composition, They are all the layers that I used in Animate. Before I do any editing, I quickly color code and sort out the layers. This will help everything stay more organized and save a lot of headaches in the long run. I also delete or hide any layers that I don't need in the final product, such as the grid I did for the background. As if color coding wasn't enough, I go ahead and pre-compose both scenes into their separate compositions. The first scene composition includes Jake and Sabrina, and the second composition includes Jake and Michael. As I have those scenes separated into their own compositions, I go ahead and inside the set compositions, I pre-compose more layers together if I see it necessary. Are you confused yet? With all this prep work, I make sure that everything I do will be easy to manage. I recommend doing so, especially if you happen to have a lot of layers in your edit, as I do. Without diving into too many details here, in After Effects, I basically added glow into the eye highlights and adjusted their transparency a little bit. I added the shadows in the first shot behind Jake and Sabrina, added Gaussian blur to the first shot of the second scene background to enforce depth, and added an extra layer of shading on top of the second scene. The part I want to focus on, and which I bet probably interests most of you, is the transition part between the scenes, where Sabrina slaps Jake with her tail and Jake is transitioned over to the next scene, where Michael is waiting to give piece of his mind to him. Because I pre-composed the scenes into two different layers, I can make the second scene appear below the first scene. In order to achieve that, I matched the shape that was supposed to be sharp and cartoony-like. I have no idea how After Effects decided for me that the sharp shape I had created will early on have such round edges, but I guess it still worked out fine. So basically, I did a mask onto the first scene layer and checked the inverted box, since I wanted that to be a spot that starts to reveal the scene below it, not another way around. Once I was pleased enough with the timing, I went to Effects and searched for the wave wrap effect. With this effect, I created the noisy effect during the transition to match the chaotic beat it would hit. It took some trial and error to get it right, which is why I recommend sleeping, because oh my gosh, my brain was such a mush while working on this. Once I was satisfied with the effect I had created, I copy-pasted the same effect at the same time onto the second scene. This way I didn't need to redo all the settings and do the timing separately again. As I was pleased with what I had done with the transition, I went over to the main composition, where I started off my sorting journey from. Onto that single layer, where this composition has everything combined, I added an effect called CC Lightburst 2.5. I love this effect. I think about it constantly in my AMV inspirations I have running through my head non-stop. And for this occasion, I thought it would be perfect to add that final punch the transition needs. After fiddling around some more with the effect settings, I had the finished product at hand. And that concludes this behind the scenes video for Original Characters Map You're No Fun Anymore. That features my characters, Jake, Sabrina, and Michael from my comic Yellow. In total, this map part took roughly 1 month of work time. However, if I were to translate that into an actual estimate of how much time I spent on this part in total, I would say somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks worth of work. I mainly worked on this part after work, during weekdays, so my pace was much lower than usual. Despite the time crunch, I'm really proud of the final result. It was amazing to get to animate yellow characters again, and hopefully I'll get to do more in the future. Thank you so much, Lady Telia, for having me on your map again. I recommend everyone to go and check out her content. It's a great watch and lovely eye candy, especially if you enjoy more detailed character designs. Once the final OC map gets finished, I'll put it at the end card. From the end card, you can also rewatch the part I did for the map individually. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Please, stay safe, wash your hands, and have a good day or night!